In 1872, a man walked into a doctor's office in Tombstone, Arizona. He was 41 years old. The doctor looked him over and told him something that would sound strange today. He told him he was already old. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. And what you're about to hear is not the version most people know. If this is the kind of history that actually tells you something real, subscribe. We go deeper here than most. Before we go any further, have you ever had a family member who lived past 90 with almost no medical care? Tell us in the comments. Because what people endured to survive in the Wild West was something entirely different from what the legends describe. Now, most people, if you ask them, will say the Wild West was violent, dangerous, short-lived. They picture gunfighters and outlaws dropping at 30, dying with their boots on, buried before they could grow gray hair. And they are not entirely wrong. But they are not entirely right either. Because the real story of life expectancy on the frontier is not a story about bullets. It is a story about water, about cold, about a bad winter and a child who never reached spring. About the slow, quiet, unglamorous ways most people actually died, and the surprising ways some of them survived. Here is what most people get wrong. They assume that because the West was lawless, death was mostly violent. That is not what the numbers say. Gunshot wounds accounted for a small fraction of deaths across the frontier. What actually killed people, what took them faster and more quietly, and more often, was disease, contaminated water, cholera outbreaks, typhoid, scarlet fever, pneumonia, a broken leg that got infected because there was no doctor within 80 miles. That was the real enemy, not the outlaw at the end of the street. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. When historians look at life expectancy data from frontier territories in the 1860s through the 1880s, they find something that forces a rethink. Average life expectancy in the United States at that time hovered around 39 to 42 years. On the frontier, it could drop even lower in certain communities. But here is the detail that changes everything. That number is an average. And that average is being dragged down dramatically by child mortality. Let that sit for a moment. A child born on the frontier in 1870 had a real chance of dying before age 5. In some territories, roughly 1 in 5 children did not survive their first year. That is not a metaphor. That is a grave marker in a prairie cemetery with a date that reads only a few months apart. When you factor those deaths into the average, the number collapses. It looks like nobody lived past 40. But that is not what was happening to the adults. Picture a small settlement in Kansas in 1868. 12 families, a few dozen people. A winter comes harder than anyone expected. By February, 2 children are dead from fever. Another is sick. The parents are exhausted, hollow-eyed, working through the cold because there is nothing else to do. When spring arrives, the adults are thinner, older looking, but they are still there, still working, still alive. That is the picture the raw numbers miss. If you made it to adulthood on the frontier, if you survived childhood, if you did not die in childbirth, if you did not fall to an epidemic in your first decade, your chances improved considerably. An adult male who reached the age of 20 in the 1870s in the American West had a reasonable chance of living into his 50s or even 60s. Some made it further. A cattle rancher who survived the hard years might still be working his land at 65, slower and stiffer, but alive. But here is the problem. Survival was not distributed equally, not even close. A man with land, money, and the ability to move when things got bad had options. A woman in a prairie dugout far from any town, with a pregnancy every year and no medical access, had almost none. The gap between survival rates for wealthy settlers and poor ones was enormous, and the gap between white settlers and the indigenous populations being forcibly displaced from their own lands was catastrophic in ways that almost never appear in the standard history. Let us stay with the women for a moment, because this is the part of the story that gets left out almost entirely. Childbirth on the frontier was one of the most dangerous things a human being could go through, not because people were careless, not because they did not try, but because they were far from help, and sometimes help did not exist even nearby. A woman giving birth alone, or attended only by neighbors with no medical training, in a one-room structure in winter, that was not unusual. That was common. Maternal mortality rates in frontier territories were significantly higher than in established eastern cities. A woman might survive the first birth, and the second. But by the third or fourth, the physical toll accumulated in ways that modern medicine would have addressed, and frontier medicine simply could not. A farmer's wife in Nebraska in 1873 is standing at the door of her sod house. She is 27 years old, and she looks 40. Her hands are cracked from cold and work. She has buried one child already. She is carrying another. The nearest doctor is in a town 2 days away by horse. She knows this. Her husband knows it. Nobody talks about it. What is there to say? That image, that silence, that is the true texture of life expectancy in the Wild West. Not the gunfight, not the saloon. The quiet endurance of people living at the absolute edge of what the body can sustain. Now think about this. If you had been born in 1855 in the American West, what do you think would have been your biggest threat to survival? Most people say outlaws or weather. The real answer, based on everything we know, is almost certainly the water you drank. Waterborne illness was the frontier's most efficient killer. Cholera epidemics swept through settlements with terrifying speed. A town of 200 people could lose 30 or 40 in a matter of weeks. And the mechanism was almost impossible for people at the time to understand, because germ theory, the basic understanding that microscopic organisms in water cause disease, was not widely accepted in the United States until the 1880s. Before that, people believed disease came from bad air. Miasma, they called it. So when cholera hit, people did the wrong things. They moved away from the smell, not the water source. They burned clothes and belongings. They treated symptoms that couldn't be treated without hydration and rest. Some drank whiskey, believing it would kill whatever was making them sick. Occasionally, by accident, they were right. Alcohol in high concentration does reduce some bacterial contamination, but mostly they died. And they died confused about why. A wagon train stops near a river crossing in 1866. The water looks fine. It is clear. It does not smell. 40 miles upstream, a dead animal has been rotting in the same river for 2 weeks. Nobody knows this. By the time the train reaches the next stop, 3 people are vomiting uncontrollably. One of them, a man of 34 who has survived the entire journey from Missouri, will be dead within 4 days. His age at death, 34. His cause of death, contaminated river water. The legend will say he died in the West. The record will not explain why. And someone, 150 years later, will look at that number and think, life was short out there, dangerous, violent. But it was water. It was always the water. Now here is where the story shifts. Because not everyone died young, not even close. There is a persistent myth that the frontier was exclusively populated by young men and women in their prime, living fast and dying faster. That is a story made for the movies. The reality is that many frontier communities had significant populations of older adults, people in their 50s, 60s, and beyond, who had made it through the difficult early years and were still contributing, still working, still present. A blacksmith sets up shop in a small Colorado mining town in 1867. He is 52 years old. He has already survived the Civil War, a cholera outbreak in 1854, and a winter in 1862 that killed 3 of his neighbors. He is not a young man. He is not a legend. He is a working craftsman with thick forearms and a bad knee and a shop that the whole town depends on. He will live to 69. He will never be written about. He will never appear in a dime novel. That man existed. Thousands of versions of him existed. The image of the frontier as a place where youth was everything and old age was impossible, that is a fiction. And it was largely created after the fact by writers and filmmakers who needed their stories to have a certain energy. The real West had old people in it, plenty of them. They were just less interesting to sell. But let us not pretend it was easy, because it was not. Even for those who survived, the physical cost of frontier life was enormous. People aged faster, not as a metaphor, but literally. The combination of hard physical labor, poor nutrition, extreme weather exposure, and limited medical care meant that a person of 40 on the frontier often had a body more comparable to a person of 55 in a modern context. The joints wore down. The teeth went early. Eyes that had spent years squinting against sun and dust did not hold up the way sheltered eyes did. A man who lived to 60 on the frontier had, in many ways, lived longer than the number suggests, and the nutrition problem was significant. Frontier diets were calorie-heavy and nutrient-poor. Beans, salt pork, cornmeal, coffee, maybe some game when hunting was good, vegetables only when a garden survived the season, which was not guaranteed. Scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, appeared in frontier communities during long winters when fresh food was unavailable. It was not a sailor's disease. It happened to families in sod houses in January who had been eating nothing but dried meat and flour for 3 months. A miner in Nevada in 1868 starts to notice his gums bleeding. He thinks it is the cold. He thinks it is the dust. He does not connect it to the absence of anything green in his diet for 4 months. Nobody tells him to eat an orange. There are no oranges. By spring, he is weaker. His teeth are loose. He is 31 years old, and his body is doing what a body deprived of essential nutrients does. He will recover when fresh food becomes available in the warmer months, but each winter chips something away. That is what survival looked like. Not dramatic, just relentless. And this is where things change again, because there is another variable that almost never gets discussed. Geography mattered enormously. Life expectancy on the frontier was not uniform. It varied dramatically depending on where you were, what resources were nearby, and what stage of settlement you were in. An established town in 1880 with a functioning water system, a general store with reliable supply lines, and a resident doctor was a fundamentally different environment than a new homestead claim in 1868 in the middle of nowhere. The further out you were, the more dangerous things became. And the danger was not violent. It was logistical. It was a broken axle 50 miles from the nearest repair. It was a wound that could have been treated in a town, but became infected because the nearest doctor was a week away. It was a pregnancy with complications, and nothing that could be done about it. A family arrives at their homestead claim in Dakota Territory in 1874. They have what they brought. There is nothing else around them for days in any direction. That first winter, the father gets a deep cut from an axe handle that splinters badly. The wound does not close cleanly. By January, his hand is red and swollen. He works through it because there is no alternative. The infection spreads. He loses the use of 2 fingers permanently. A doctor in Omaha, given access to the same wound in the same year, might have saved the hand fully. But Omaha is not here. Here, there is just the cold and the work and the knowledge that stopping is not an option. He survives. He is one of the lucky ones. Now, what does all of this mean for the actual numbers? Here is the honest answer. Life expectancy in the Wild West era, measured correctly and honestly, was not uniformly low for everyone. The numbers that look so stark, averages in the late 30s or early 40s, are almost entirely a product of child mortality. Remove the children who died before age 5, and the picture changes dramatically. Adults who made it through childhood and avoided the major acute killers, epidemic disease, childbirth complications, severe accidents, often lived into their 50s and 60s. Some lived longer. But the conditions required to reach that age were punishing in ways that are difficult to fully grasp. A 60-year-old woman sitting on the porch of her farmhouse in Kansas in 1888 has seen things that would be barely comprehensible today. She has buried children. She has survived at least one epidemic. She has worked through winters that would shut down a modern city. She has done all of this without reliable medicine, without insulation, without plumbing, without any of the infrastructure that modern people consider basic. She is not nostalgic about it. She is just tired. That tiredness. That is the thing the legends never show. And here is something that almost never gets mentioned when people talk about life in the Wild West. Mental health. The psychological cost of frontier life was immense and almost entirely undocumented. Isolation was a constant feature of homestead living. Families spent months barely seeing another human being outside their own household. In winter, that isolation could become total. Weeks inside a small structure with the same people, unable to leave because of snow or cold, without distraction, without news, without community. The psychological toll of that, of loss, of grinding work, of uncertainty, of watching people die and not being able to stop it, was something people carried without language for it. Depression on the frontier was not diagnosed. It was not treated. It was not even named. People called it low spirits, or tiredness, or nothing at all. A man who went quiet and stopped working was just trouble. A woman who could not get out of bed was just weak. There was no system to catch these people. There was no concept that what they were experiencing was a condition rather than a character flaw. A sheriff in a small Texas town in 1875 sits at his desk at 11 at night. He has held this job for 6 years. He has buried people he tried to protect. He has sent men to prison who came back angrier. He has watched the town slowly lose population as the railroad bypassed it and businesses closed. He is not afraid. He is just exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix. He will keep doing the job. There's nothing else. But every year he looks a little more worn than the year before, and nobody around him has the words for what is happening to him. What killed him eventually? Hard to say. Heart failure at 57. But the 6 years of compounding stress and isolation contributed to that in ways the death certificate could not record. This is the hidden cost, the slow accounting. Now let us talk about who had it worst. Because life expectancy on the frontier was not just a matter of geography and luck, It was shaped by something far more fundamental. It was shaped by power. The people with the lowest life expectancy in the American West during this era were not the gunfighters in the famous towns. They were not even the isolated homesteaders. They were the indigenous populations being displaced from their lands, forced into reservation conditions with inadequate food, inadequate shelter, and active destruction of the social and cultural systems that had sustained them for generations. Mortality rates in reservation communities during the 1870s and 1880s were catastrophic. Disease rates were high. Food insecurity was severe. The systematic destruction of traditional food sources, particularly the mass killing of the buffalo, removed the nutritional foundation that entire communities had depended on for centuries. A family that has lived on these plains for 10 generations arrives at a reservation boundary in 1876. What they encounter is not a new home. It is a stockade. They are expected to become farmers in an instant, on land that is often poor, with tools they have never used, growing crops they have never grown. The food supplies that were promised have not arrived in full. It is winter. Children are hungry. The life expectancy numbers for these communities during this period are among the most devastating in American history. They are almost never included when people discuss Wild West life expectancy in popular conversation. That omission is not an accident. It is a choice, and it changes the story completely. Here is another truth that rarely surfaces. The gunfighters and outlaws who defined the Wild West in popular imagination actually had statistically some of the higher life expectancy outcomes among dangerous occupation groups because their mortality was sudden and early when it came. But many of them survived into middle age. The real toll was on the people doing ordinary work, the people digging in mines, the people laying railroad tracks. These were the occupations that ground people down consistently, quietly, at scale. A team of men lays railroad track in Nevada in 1868. They work in summer heat that reaches 110 degrees in the shade. They drink water from barrels that have been sitting in that heat. They lift and carry and hammer for 10 to 12 hours a day. They sleep in camps with no sanitation. Pay is low. Injuries are common. A man who drops a spike on his foot and cannot work is simply let go. There is no compensation, no sick leave, no safety standard. He walks back to wherever he came from if he can, or he stays in camp and heals on his own time, while eating whatever the camp has available, which is not much. These men had short working lives. Many had short lives altogether. Their names do not appear in the history books. Their graves are often unmarked. They built the infrastructure that opened the West, and the West largely forgot them before they were cold in the ground. And what about the doctors? Because there is a myth here too. People assume that frontier doctors were incompetent, barely trained, more dangerous than helpful. And in some cases, this was true. There were men calling themselves doctors on the frontier who had no formal training at all. They had a bag of tools and some confidence, and that was roughly it. The combination of a clean incision and dirty instruments was not unusual. Surgeries performed without antiseptic in environments full of bacteria often ended in fatal infections regardless of technical skill. But here is the complication. Some frontier doctors were genuinely well trained. Medical education in the United States in the 1860s and 70s was inconsistent. Some schools were excellent, some were not. But the best trained frontier physicians, working under impossible conditions, saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. They did not have what modern medicine has, but they used what they had with skill, and sometimes that was enough. A doctor rides into a mining settlement at midnight in 1879. He has been awake for 30 hours. He has ridden 20 miles in the dark. The man waiting for him has a shattered leg. Without intervention, infection will kill him within a week. The doctor sets the bone as cleanly as he can, cleans the wound with what he has, and wraps it. He stays 2 days to monitor. The miner survives. He walks with a limp for the rest of his life. He lives to 63. That doctor's presence, in that moment, at that distance, made the difference between a man dying at 31 and a man dying at 63. That is what frontier medicine looked like at its best. Not triumphant, just enough. Here's a question worth sitting with. If you could choose when to live in the Wild West era, not where, not as whom, just when, what decade would give you the best survival odds? Think about it for a moment. The answer most people overlook is the 1880s. By that decade, several things had shifted in ways that meaningfully improved survival. Germ theory was beginning to change how disease was understood and prevented. More towns had basic water systems. The railroad had reduced isolation in ways that shortened the distance between a medical emergency and actual help. More trained physicians were present in more places. Basic public health measures, still primitive but better than nothing, were beginning to appear. A child born in a frontier town in 1880 had better survival odds than a child born in the same type of town in 1860. Not dramatically better, but meaningfully better. The knowledge was moving. The infrastructure was building. The frontier was, in the slowest possible way, becoming something more survivable. But that improvement was not smooth. It was not guaranteed. It was not distributed to everyone equally. In the same decade that some frontier towns were getting their first reliable water systems, there were still homesteads and communities where nothing had changed, where people were still drinking from the same water sources their neighbors had used, where children were still dying of diseases that were already preventable in the cities. The frontier was not one thing. It was 100 different things happening at the same time, with wildly different outcomes depending on where you were and who you were. A woman in a growing frontier town in 1883 is in a clean general store buying soap. Outside, through the window, she can see a new building going up. There is a physician in town now, a trained one, with actual medical school behind him. The water comes from a new well dug upstream of the settlement. Her children are alive, all 3 of them. She does not count this as luck exactly, but she does not take it for granted either. 20 miles away, a family in an isolated homestead is dealing with a water situation that is exactly what it was 10 years ago. Their nearest neighbor is 6 miles distant. There is no doctor. There is no new well. There is just the same creek they have always used. Both of these realities existed simultaneously. Both were the Wild West. The difference in life expectancy between them was not small. Let us come back to the numbers one more time, because they tell a story that the popular imagination consistently refuses to accept. The most dangerous phase of life on the frontier was the earliest, birth through age 5. A child who survived that window had a genuinely reasonable chance of reaching adulthood. An adult who avoided epidemic disease, severe injury without medical access, and, in the case of women, complicated childbirth, had a meaningful chance of making it to 50 or 60. The average life expectancy numbers that look so stark, numbers that show up in casual historical summaries and make the Wild West seem like a place where nobody lived past 40, are averages that include every infant who died at a week old, every child who died at 2, every young woman who died in childbirth at 20. Remove those deaths, and the underlying adult survival picture changes significantly. But here is the part nobody wants to say out loud. Removing those deaths is a statistical trick. Those deaths were real. Those infants were real. Those mothers were real. The fact that their deaths drag down the average does not make the average wrong. It means the average is telling you the truth, and the truth is hard. Life on the frontier was genuinely shorter, genuinely harder, and genuinely more brutal than almost any experience available in a modern developed country today. A grave marker in a frontier cemetery reads, 1861 to 1861. That is not a data point. That was a person. That was a family's grief. And there are thousands of those markers in cemeteries across the West, weathered now to almost nothing, the inscriptions barely readable, the names almost gone. The real Wild West was not the action of the gunfight. It was the silence after, the graves on the hill behind the town, the children who did not make it, the mothers who wore out before their time, the workers who built things they never got to enjoy, the old people who survived everything and were never celebrated for it. That is the life expectancy story of the Wild West. Not short because of violence. Short because of water, and cold, and isolation, and 1,000 small things that added up to a world where staying alive required more from the human body than the human body was always able to give. And yet, people stayed. People built. People came back the next spring after a winter that should have broken them. They put seeds in the ground again. They repaired the fences. They had more children, knowing what that meant. They kept going. Not because it was easy, because stopping was not an option. That quiet, grinding endurance, not the gun, not the legend, is what the Wild West actually was. And now, you know something about it that most people never will.